Welcome back to the Minnesota Black Robe Regiment channel. Thanks for tuning in. If you are a first-time viewer, I hope that you are challenged or encouraged, whatever you came here looking for. If you agree with me, I'd love to hear about it. If you disagree, I would love even more to hear about that as well. If you like what you hear, subscribe. Let me just get that out of the way up front. If you don't like what you hear, subscribe, and maybe we can reason together in comments or through email or whatever the case might be. I want to talk in this video a little bit about an experience that I had on the evening of September 7th in the city of Rochester, Minnesota. And this has nothing to do with any city policy or any interactions with city officials there, but it does have to do with what I see as a overriding, very powerful mentality in the city of Rochester as a whole. And to some degree, it is a prevailing attitude in all of the larger metro type areas in many left-leaning states. So for those of you who aren't aware, the state of Minnesota has had a mask mandate in place since pretty much the last couple of weeks of July. Rochester itself instituted a mask or facial covering mandate a couple of weeks before that. In a previous video I talked about Comrade Kim, the mayor of Rochester, who complained about being bullied by men, being pushed around by men because they disagreed with her about her mask mandate. She begged and pleaded with the governor in public and on social media to implement a statewide mask mandate to limit the freedom of business owners to take their businesses outside of the city limits of Rochester to avoid mask mandates. So you'll probably see where I'm going with this. And if you're sick of talking about masks, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. This is a very important topic, but not for the reason most people think. I'm not going to argue that the prevalence of medical science changes on a daily basis. Everybody knows that. In the beginning of the COVID hysteria, we were told, save masks for healthcare workers, and then we were told masks don't help at all anyway, and we were told that a certain kind of mask is the only kind of mask that would work, and then we were told everybody should cover up, but it should be something, anything, cloth mask, neck gaiter, on and on and on. Our own governor, Commissar Walz, told us that he realizes that by and large facial coverings don't actually work, but they make your neighbor feel better. It's a psychological ploy to tell you to make your neighbor feel better and to do something that would encourage your neighbor to feel better, knowing that it's really not going to do anything to make your neighbor healthier or safer. So, since the inception of the mask mandate, facial covering mandate by the governor, I have very vocally stated that the only place that I will wear a facial covering is when I'm working, period. My employer has every right within reason to demand that I wear one if they decide to require it as part of my uniform. And when I say uniform, anybody who goes to work, you have a uniform. You have a uniform. Your employer has a requirement of what you will and will not wear while you're working. Now, having said that, that's an employer-employee issue. That is not an employer-employee general public issue. So if you are an employer and you require your staff to wear facial coverings while they're working, good for you, and good on your staff for following your directions. But as an employer, employers cannot make their staff wear masks when they're not working. They have no control over that. None. And likewise, there's this mentality behind wearing, for lack of better terminology, or wearing facial coverings at the behest of the governor's fiat arbitrary decision that we should be, that you cannot do business in the state of Minnesota unless you're wearing a mask. And the governor knows that this is not enforceable by law. He knows it's not enforceable by law. Most law enforcement agencies in the state of Minnesota have flat out said, we are not going to be the mask police. We're not going to get involved in enforcing this. For one, we don't have the manpower. Two, we don't have the man hours. And three, it's a civil issue, not a criminal issue. And law enforcement officers are not, by and large, responsible for civil matters. So that leaves the governor in a position where he has to mandate that businesses enforce this policy not only on their staff but on their clientele, on their guests, through the penalty of licensure loss, through the penalty of fines and imposition of penalties if they don't enforce them. And businesses that are saying, look, we're not only are we not going to enforce this, but we're also not going to be posting your signs, have been told, we will either force you to do this through massive fines and penalties, or we will nickel and dime you to death if you think you can fight us on this. We will send in state agencies, health departments, and occupational safety departments, and we will send them in and we will just nitpick you until you can't stand it anymore and you either shut your doors or you comply. So we're in a very strange place where I think that many of the people working in public businesses with a public front or public face are in a very awkward position where they have to enforce a mandate. And oftentimes we're talking about people that are making $10, $12, $13, $14 an hour, and sometimes some of them are making small business minimum wage. And they're being required by the government to work as enforcement agents of the government. So this is a very perilous minefield that not only the business owners, business managers have to navigate, but it's also a very perilous minefield for the everyday citizen of Marxisota to navigate as well. One, you have to decide how much you're going to accept by way of fiat decisions that are really ultimately a violation of the constitutional authority of any governor or any other elected official. And you also have to decide for yourself how much of a fight is worth your liberty. I have made the decision that my liberty is worth any disagreement or any fight, if you will, that I might encounter. Now, I've made some exceptions for that. There's a particular business in the city that I live in, the small town that I live in, where I have friends and family members that are employed, and I have made the decision that for their peace of mind, I will wear a face covering when I enter that business, not to be compliant to the governor's mandate, but to take the pressure off of this loved one, of this friend, this loved one, to not have to answer for me not wearing a facial covering in this business. I don't want them to lose their job or be harassed because of me. That's a sacrificial act on my part. Other than that, I don't wear them. To give you an example, Monday night, the 7th of September, I took my family out to eat at Famous Dave's in Rochester. I initially put the facial covering on because I didn't want to put the family in a very odd position where if there was a confrontation, they would feel that they needed to leave or couldn't be in there. And I had promised them dinner. So initially I put it on, and I realized the stupidity, as so many people are pointing out right now, is that you have to wear this facial covering as you walk through the restaurant until you're seated, and then once you're seated you can take it off, because now you're not in danger, and you're actively eating or drinking the entire time you're in a restaurant, because they bring you water or they bring you a drink. Couldn't get mixed drinks at Famous Dave's on Monday night because COVID-19 has, and I kid you not, made it untenable for them to keep liquor on the premises because they don't go through it fast enough. Because they're not busy. I guess alcohol doesn't keep. But that aside, prior to going out for dinner and realizing the fallacy of the idea of wearing a facial covering in a restaurant for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, whatever it takes to get to your table, we had gone to a local Goodwill in Rochester, the newest one, and I wasn't wearing a facial covering. I wasn't going to wear one. And here's the deal. It probably sounds very rebellious. And to some degree, I suppose that it is. Anytime you're not doing something that a ruling official, and that's really how Commissar Walls is treating this, is he is a ruler, and he has the right to enforce whatever he deems to be necessary on you, and you are rebellious if you don't follow my instructions. You shall do as I say. That's his attitude. And that's actually the attitude of the majority of the people who support him. But I'm not doing this. I'm not wearing a facial covering everywhere that I go. One, this isn't an ordinance. It's not a state statute. It's not a code. It's not a code. It's unenforceable. The only way that this works is we comply, and they get the compliance that they want because they get us to be afraid that we're not going to be able to do business someplace. We're not going to be able to buy goods and services, whether they're needed, whether they're ancillary to our regular life, whether it's to put food on our table or fuel in our cars. They have people convinced in the state of Minnesota that your life is going to be drastically impacted if you refuse to wear a facial covering because you're not going to have the freedom to buy goods and services without it. And that played out in the Goodwill on Monday night. I watched a employee at this Goodwill approach a couple of young men who had been at both the Goodwills, because we had seen them in the one on the south side of town, and then we ran into them on the north side of town. Both confront a couple of young men who weren't wearing face coverings. And this employee intimidated them into wearing their facial coverings. Never mind the fact that he did not walk around and police the people who were walking around Goodwill and had their facial coverings down below their lips, down below their nose. It was only those who were not wearing them. And he made a beeline for me. And I knew I was not going to be able to get out of the store, and I, quite frankly, didn't want to get out of the store. I had no desire to get out of the store. I was looking at some stuff, and I was with my family, and I caught it on a video. I'm not going to share the video publicly. Not at this time, but I caught it on video, and he said, "Sir, you need to cover your face." And I said, "I don't wear a mask, thank you." And he said, "Well, you have to have a reason." And I said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing. Excuse me. He goes, "Well, you can't. There's no exemptions." And I said, "Are you sure of that?" And he goes, "Well, there are medical exemptions." So what's your medical exemption? He asked me what my medical exemption was. By law, they can't ask that. They're not allowed to ask that. They're legally, by law, they're not allowed to ask that. And I told him so. I said, "Are you sure you want to ask me that question? Do you want to ask me that question, sir?" And then he made a comment. He goes, "Well, if you're not going to wear a mask, you need to follow the arrows. If you don't follow the arrows, you can't buy anything." He said that. If you do not follow the arrows, you will not be allowed to purchase any items here in the store. And I turned around and I very, frankly said, "So you're refusing to do business with me because I'm not going to wear a mask and I'm not following the arrows?" Now, he got quite defensive, and he says, "Well, I need to know." He basically asked me why I wasn't wearing a mask again, and I said, "You're not allowed to ask me that." And he goes, "Well, it's a mandate," he goes, "It's a statute." And it's not a statute. And a lady who was standing there who had on a plastic face shield, not a mask or a covering, but an actual one of those goggle type shields. She goes, It is a code or a statute. And it's not a statute. And so here's the difference for those of you that are wondering. A governor's executive order is exactly that. It's an executive order, and in some ways, in some shapes, in some forms, that can carry some weight, some heft behind it. However, the governor does not have the power to implement code, to implement statute. He doesn't have that kind of power. No elected executive in the state of Minnesota has the constitutional power to do that, whether it's a mayor of a city, a county administrator, the county board, whatever. An administrator or whatnot. They don't have the executive power to make law, to legislate. Only county boards, city councils, the House and the Senate of your state, in the state of Minnesota in particular, have that power. That's legislation. Codes and statutes are legislation. Those have to be enacted by either the legislature or county board or the city councils or the township boards. That's the only way. These people believe it's a statute. They believe it carries the weight of law behind it. They're convinced. So, where this got hairy was an older man who I'm assuming was some sort of supervisor, very vocally, very loudly, started to speak to the other young man, or to the young man who confronted me, and said, "He's not allowed to shop here, and even if he does bring things, we don't have to sell them to him. Whether he has a medical exemption or not, we don't have to do business with him." Now, I'm not going to get into the finer points of medical exemptions, but you need to understand, no one's allowed to ask you that. No one. They can't even have you trespass from the store for refusing to tell them. You don't have to carry proof that you have a medical exemption because no one's required to demonstrate their medical exemption. Period. End of story. People need to understand this. Your medical privacy is exactly that. It's your medical privacy. No one has a right to know whether or not you're vaccinated. No one has a right to know what your medical diagnoses are. No one has a right to know. No one has a compelling reason to know whether or not you have a medical exemption. No one. Law enforcement can't ask you that. Business owners can't ask you that. Managers, employees, staff of any business cannot ask you if you have a medical exemption. If they do, they violated the law and they violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. Period. End of story. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody go out there and fight it and then threaten to sue, because if you're going to sue, you better have a medical exemption. But what you have to understand is, if you don't stand up to this, then your little old lady neighbor who literally cannot wear a mask for a medical reason, or your young child neighbor who cannot wear one for a medical reason, is going to be subjected to these same things. This is how they win. They scare you into compliance. They bully you into compliance. And then they do things like try to publicly shame you, which is exactly what the older gentleman did then. He made a point right in front of me to walk up to the cashier and very loudly and very vociferously tell her that he is not allowed to buy anything here because he won't tell us what his exemption is. He won't tell us why he can't wear a mask. So whether he has a medical exemption or not, he does not get to buy anything here. Now, he did it very loudly. He did it in front of other customers in the store. And he was really being pushy on her. And you could see the discomfort on the cashier's face. And I asked him about it. I said, "Sir, what was that?" He goes, "You're not allowed to be in here without that mask. We're enforcing the governor's orders." And I'm like, "But are you allowed to ask if I have an exemption?" And he couldn't answer that question. Now remember, I'm sure I could have probably been a little more gentle than I was. I'm not going to argue that. I'm sure that it was a very awkward situation for him, and I'm sorry for that for him. It's a horrible position for him as an employee to be in. But that's why this needs to change. This needs to change because it's causing violations of our medical freedom, violations of our medical liberty, our liberty as Americans. It's a violation of liberty of conscience, and there's a whole series of things that go on down the line. And the reason why I'm doing this video, and trust me, there's probably some risk here for me in putting this video out, and I'm willing to take that risk right now. And here's why. When I called him on whether or not he had the authority to ask me what reason I had to not wear a facial covering in the store, he said he couldn't answer the question. Then he got mad at me and he said, "Get out of my face or I'm calling the cops." I wasn't in his face, and I wasn't angry. He was rude. He was verbally abrasive. There was a physical abrasiveness to him as well. He was very hostile. And I told him that. I said, "Sir, I haven't been rude to you. The hostile person here has been you, and it's unprofessional." Now, like I said, there's probably a risk in me putting this out. And I won't get into why in this particular video. But it's one that I'm willing to take because we have to start standing up. And I've said that numerous times already in this video. We have to stand. We need to stand. If we don't, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. We are going to be in a whole lot of trouble going forward. We have problems in this country. And right now, for the most part, all of the problems that we're having in the state of Minnesota are because our governor is a leftist, our largest cities are run by leftists, the people tend to lean that way. I mean, how else do leftists get elected is if the people don't lean that way. We have to resist this. And I want you to ask yourselves, people of Minnesota, how long did they tell us they needed to get COVID-19 under control? 2 weeks. March 13th, 2 weeks. So that should have been March 27th. Where are we now? By the time you see this, it'll be September 9th or 10th. So let's count the months, okay? April, May, June, July, August, September. 6 months of 2 weeks. 6 months. Our state's been devastated. Devastated by this. People are terrified. And I see it on their faces. The man at Goodwill yesterday, on Monday, he wasn't scared of me. He's scared of a virus he doesn't understand. He's scared because he's been told it's a deadly pandemic. He's scared because he's been told it's his job to enforce a governor's mandate that is not enforceable by law. And he's scared of anyone who isn't complying because he's been told that people who do not comply should be considered dangerous. If you don't comply, you've been placed in the same camp as a terrorist. Do you understand that? If you don't comply with stay-at-home orders, if you don't comply with social distancing orders, if you don't comply with directional arrows in a store, if you don't comply with mask mandates or facial covering mandates, you have been effectively defined as a terrorist, as a rebellious insurrectionist. People are more scared of you than they are of the violent thugs that are burning down the cities of Minneapolis and Portland and Seattle and Rochester, New York, and Atlanta, Georgia, Washington, D.C., Kenosha, Wisconsin. People are more terrified of you and violent rioters than they are of peaceful resistors. Think about that. Without even talking about the science, how far are you willing to be pushed around? What are you willing to take? Sic semper tyrannis.